3.5 years ago, I recorded the audio for my very first episode the day after Ponycast. I was a new fan then, and my thoughts were all over the place, but it's neat to see my opinions from back then crystallized in video form. As a whole, my opinions haven't changed that drastically much, save for a small subset of characters that already bogart a good slice of fan discussion online. Two of them come with enough baggage to fill an hour-long deep dive each, so instead let's give a shout out to the one character I sold especially short. Early Twilight Sparkle existed in a bit of a vacuum. For the first half of the first season, I found her kind of flat at best and downright unsympathetic at worst. I get that this was a symptom of her being partially molded to serve as an audience surrogate, but until we had something to really latch onto, there wasn't much sketched in the way of characterization compared to her more colorful friends. But I've also watched enough television to know that the central character in a work of fiction often needs a bit of run-up space. Many of my favorite TV shows of all time feature initially bland central characters that come across as pretty one-note compared to their louder, more interesting friends, but by the time the team gets around to coloring them in, they're frequently among the best episodes in their respective series because the creators took that extra time to cook up something special. Book Horse had a small handful of these character demonstration episodes, and the 3 episodes in particular that I want to talk about make for a great 1-hour triple feature if you watch them back to back like I did to prep for this video. You get to see her worldview evolve over the course of the series and learn a handful of good lessons in the process. Let me show you what I mean. This might sound like a dumb question, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this. What do we know about Twilight? Well, for one, she's smart, or at least curious, which is far more important to her character. We see her reading in her first on-screen appearance, not because she knows everything, but because she wants to. It's a trait that's propped up by her housing situation over the course of the series, which went from a giant library to a cozier cottagecore library to a castle with an entire wing dedicated to books. Girl likes learning things. But we also know that she's a perfectionist from her season 2 snafu trying not to break her streak of weekly letters to Celestia. I'm not covering lesson 0 here because I don't think that episode did her many favors, and the lesson at hand wasn't really about her in the end, but it was definitely the first time I really felt like she was someone I could relate to. When I went to school, I didn't have a ton of friends, and test taking was one of the few things I was good at, to the point that the first time I got a B, I cried for almost an hour about it. That's the third thing that she and I have in common. We're both really anxious people. These traits go hand in hand more often than you think, and the first episode is a sort of perfect storm of these character traits. Twilight and her friends are tasked with being the welcome committee for Miss Harshwinny the Games Inspector ahead of the Equestria Games, a real BFD for the newly resurrected Crystal Empire. Right off the bat, this task is signaled as something extremely important when Rainbow Dash turns the drama up to 11 with her story about Cloudsdale missing out on the chance to host the games. But on the softer side, Twilight was asked to do this by Princess Cadence, a family friend turned sister-in-law whose opinion she really respects. This might explain why we see her drilling the already perfect welcome routine with her friends early in the episode. This narrow-sighted, anxious focus on being perfect results in 2 critical oversights: the story-driven problem of escorting around the wrong pony after mistaking Miss Peachbottom for the inspector, and the inability to clock that their mistaken guest is going through some anxieties of her own. After being cooped up on a long train ride, she has a full-on panic attack when she gets a pot stuck on her head, and you can see her getting overwhelmed earlier by the staggering size of the castle. Even if you're grappling with an issue that you've worked up in your head to be this huge problem, other people are likely too busy going through their own challenges to notice. But none of that seems to register while Twi is desperately trying to keep it together, navigating preparations while trying to take her brother's breathing exercises to heart. Things fall apart in the second act, but victory is snatched from the jaws of defeat after a chance meeting at the spa causes the 2 guests to compare notes. Even though they completely flopped on showing Harshwinny a good time, the absolutely glowing recommendation from their accidental guest of honor is enough for her to let the Crystal Empire host the games anyway. It's like that hokey saying goes, people may forget what you did for them, but they won't forget how you made them feel. I'd also like to point out the first of 3 lies that gets hammered out of Twilight's noggin by each of these 3 episodes. The idea that you can never make mistakes. That's obviously wrong, down to the thematically relevant scratch on Peachbottom's luggage, but we all learn that at some point in our lives, and Twilight just happened to be one of today's lucky 10,000. A couple seasons later, Twilight goes on another spiral of self-discovery after realizing that she really wasn't that great a friend to the fillies she grew up with back at Canterlot. It was a harmless passing comment from Spike, but with Twilight's perfectionism, her new wings, and her responsibilities as the Princess of Friendship, he may as well have called her a slur. Amending Fences is a fantastic episode of television in general, to the point that it made my top 5 when I ranked every episode last year. It does so many things right, first among them being rooting the conflict in an actual scene from the very first episode. We've known since the beginning that Twilight bailed on her friend Moondancer's party, even if we didn't think it would have any plot relevance. This sounds like an inconsequential detail, but hear me out. If this conflict was based on a new scene that was written, blocked, and animated just for this episode, I don't think it would have the same impact as it did with a recontextualization of a scene that viewers remember. This is a jerk move from younger, aloof Twilight, which makes her unease about the situation hit that much harder. It also brings up an interesting trait in Twilight that will become more important going forward. Twilight's kinda selfish, especially at the start of the series, but throughout it too. We see on display in a handful of episodes where her interactions with her friends revolve around wanting to have things her way, which is not at all to say she's a bad character. She's in my personal top 5. But it's like Celestia said in Night of the Living Apples. We all have good and bad traits about ourselves. That doesn't mean we're bad people. And as much as she wanted to check on her friends back in Canterlot, the decision to go back is rooted at least somewhat in selfish desires. A sense that I can't be the princess of friendship if I let someone down. I should go back and show them how good a friend I am now. She doesn't even remember their names at the top of the episode. I won't get too deep into the weeds on this because that train of thinking leads down a huge philosophical rabbit hole, but I really want to re-emphasize that trait of hers because it's more shading than she got in any of the season 1 episodes, and it's something that will become more important down the line. It's also a big reason that her first meeting with her friends from Canterlot is so supremely awkward. My read on Twilight in this episode is that she intended to give that speech about her being a terrible friend and to have her friends express forgiveness so that she can erase this lingering sense of guilt, but somehow the response she gets is so much worse.
Sure, it might have stung a little bit when you ran off to Ponyville without saying goodbye, but it's not like we weren't used to that from you.
If this is an episode about atoning for the person you used to be, the idea that she was such a terrible friend that it was somehow on brand for her to skip town and not tell them is absolutely brutal. It also robs her of the catharsis of forgiveness, which is a large part of why she went in the first place. Twilight and Spike track down Moondancer, in all ways the perfect foil for Twilight Sparkle. Though their two life paths diverged wildly, these are two ponies that started out so similar it's scary. I have no doubt that designer Cora Kosika's decision to give her Twilight's mane and tail model was 100% intentional. They also diverge on their attitudes toward forgiveness when it comes to their history together. After helping Moondancer break out of her shell, Twilight completely ditched her to move to Ponyville without so much as a goodbye, and while the girls at the donut shop got over it pretty quickly, Moondancer absolutely did not. A cynical friend of mine once told me that forgiveness is essentially choosing not to waste any more mental energy on something that happened in your past, but she has every right to be upset, and her forgiveness isn't something that Twilight can just take. It doesn't stop her from trying though, first by bribing her with the keys to her old library, and again by offering to teach her high-level magic. There's that selfishness again, and it continues when she calls in a favor from Pinkie to try to recreate the party that she missed. Too little too late though, and Moondancer makes a show of airing all her personal grievances on the castle lawn, and I can't really blame her. Twilight tries to reason that she's a different person than the one who ditched her all those years ago, and Moondancer rebuts her by reminding her that it doesn't change what she did in the past. This is the second lie that Twilight unlearns over the course of the 3 episodes, the idea that all mistakes can be erased. At this point, all Twilight can do is acknowledge what she did and how awful it was, and promise to try to do better. And it's not until she stops making the issue about herself and starts actually knocking out the 3-step apology process that things actually start to click. This is a top 5 episode for a reason, and the second big step she takes between the bookworm she was at the start of the series and the ruler she would eventually become. Step number 3 occurred 4 years later, after a package from an old acquaintance brought back some more forgotten memories from her time in Canterlot. While The Point of No Return acts as a bog-standard episode about an overdue library book, it quickly became one of my favorites, due in part to a pair of really effectively written twists that catch her completely off guard. As soon as Twilight and Spike arrive in Canterlot to return the book, we get the immediate return of that selfish energy I talked about in Chapter 2, as she's more worried about getting laughed at or losing her best book borrower title than actually returning the book. Some of the dialogue here seems a little on the nose, but if you read this episode as being hyperbolized by Twilight's overwhelming sense of perfectionism, some of these line deliveries make a bit more sense.
You need to go and see First Folio in the grossly overdue book return office for ponies who should know better. Don't pull any punches with those names, do ya?
After they run out of leads trying to track down Dusty Pages, the story opens up when Twilight and Spike run into Moondancer out to lunch with one of the other librarians. As a quick aside, it was a really good choice to throw Moondancer into this scene too. It helps the scene flow better, but it also helps to reinforce the previous character growth episode in Chapter 2, and putting a returning character in a returning restaurant from 2 separate episodes is just good world building. It's when Dusty's gossipy old co-worker implies that she left because of the overdue book that Twilight has the first of 2 two major epiphanies in this episode. It's one thing for her to want to return a book to maintain her library cred, but the thought that she might have gotten her old librarian fired causes her to have a come to Celestia moment. She's not exactly a stranger to doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, but getting to see that light switch go off in her head in real time was a really powerful writing decision. She spends the bulk of Act 2 trying to track down Dusty Pages, now with a more urgent, palpable sense of guilt driving her motivation.
But what about your late fees?
They're not as important as making things right.
She's still holding on to this urge to correct her earlier mistakes when she finally tracks down Dusty at a local retirement home, and she's shocked when she's met with open arms.
I don't remember you doing anything wrong.
Remember earlier when I talked about people remembering how they felt instead of what you did? Turns out Dusty lived a rich, full life after she left the library, from painting to paintball, which was even foreshadowed earlier by the residents of Silver Stable Community while Twilight was busy panicking. As it turns out, it was Twi's late library book that caused her to reevaluate her life. She stopped worrying so much about being perfect at the one thing she knew she was good at and started trying new things, a lesson that Twilight finds especially relevant to her own situation. This is the deconstruction of the third big crack in Twilight's worldview, that nothing good ever comes from making mistakes.
Twilight, your late book was the best thing that ever happened to me.
There's even a bookworm-friendly metaphor at the end, when it's revealed that her library book, Perfection: The Impossible Pursuit, was replaced with a newer edition ages ago, long before it ever showed up at her doorstep. And that's what I feel like Twilight became, a new edition of herself. We're all changing all the time, and the idea that you have to stay the way you were when you were younger is silly at best and misguided at worst. We're not books. That's why we don't go on the shelf. Thanks a lot for watching, and happy Twilight Day! I love doing these character deep dives because I always leave them with a deeper appreciation for a character near and dear to me. My version of the Perfection Isn't Everything lesson was that teacher from the series finale of Courage the Cowardly Dog, but other purple animals need to hear that message too, you know? What's your favorite thing about Twilight? Let me know in the comments, or if there's another character you'd like me to deep dive in the future. Until next time, I'm some horse on the internet. Thanks for watching.